Well, I figured for this one, obviously at the end, it's good to talk about the resurrection. This is the big one. So if this one is true, then really, it's not that nothing else matters. I mean, I think even the little things matter to some extent. But, if you think about it, if the resurrection is true, and let's just say worst case scenario, we find out that somehow neo-Darwinism is true. If Jesus got up out of the grave, then even if there's unanswered questions, like the fact that the resurrection happened means Christianity follows. And, some people that do this minimal facts approach to the resurrection, they point out that even if you could say that there are errors in the Bible, you can actually still prove the resurrection. You don't need an inerrant Bible. Now, just to be clear, I believe that the Bible is inerrant. And there are some people that actually don't like the minimal facts approach because they don't like the fact that people say you don't need an inerrant Bible. And really, there are some people that would say that it's inappropriate for me to stand up here and try to give you historical proofs for the resurrection because, we just believe it by faith. Or it might sound like I'm putting history above the Bible. But number one, I think the Bible is inerrant. I think it's authoritative. I do not think that about the historical sources. But I do think that God kind of orchestrated history in such a way that we could check these things out. So the way I like to start this out is just asking, what are some of your favorite miracles and why?
Like when he fed the thousands.
Okay.
Especially the second time, because the disciples were still like, "What are we gonna do?"
Yeah. Do you not remember what happened the first time?
Now, is the second one the feeding of the 4,000 or the feeding of the 5,000?
I thought it was the 5,000.
Yeah, I thought so too. And that is actually, for every time that I've taught this, that is the number one miracle that people bring up. It's the feeding of the 5,000. I think people really like eating food. Anything else?
Like when he raises the little girl.
I was thinking that too.
Jairus' daughter? Is that the same story?
I don't know the parent's name.
Okay. Yeah?
He says, "Little girl, get up."
Mm-hmm.
Basically.
Yeah. That's similar, like with Lazarus. He just tells him to come out. It's kind of cool.
I was thinking Lazarus.
Okay.
I like Peter walking on the water.
Why do you like that one?
I don't know. It just shows. I mean, he gets out all confident, and he's like, wait a second. And he starts to sink, and then it's like, hey, I'm still here. It's like, oh yeah, okay. I don't know. It's relatable.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Do you have one?
Well, you talking New Testament or Old?
Anyone?
Well, the parting of the Red Sea. And
Yeah.
the one that has a little humor in it is when he makes a donkey speak.
Okay, yeah. That's true.
That would be pretty fun.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible says, donkeys don't talk, but that was God, talking through the donkey. Okay, good. I've mentioned before that one of my favorite miracles is in Kings, when the axe head floats. And so basically some guys are cutting down some trees by the river, axe head falls off into the water, and the guy freaks out because the axe head was borrowed. And one of the prophets is either Elisha or Elijah. I always get those two confused, and I was too lazy to look it up. But they come down, they throw a stick in the water, and the axe head floats. I think it's kind of like a weird miracle for a couple reasons. But I've also said before that not all miracles are created equal. So, for example, all the way back at the beginning, we talked about the beginning of the universe. And obviously that was a one-time event, very improbable. But the effects of that can still be seen today. We can actually prove that. Now, I can't prove to you that the axe head was made to float. I believe that the Bible is true, so I believe that the axe head did in fact float. But there are miracles that you can prove. And so the question for tonight is the resurrection one of those miracles that can be proved? Now, the resurrection is obviously central to our beliefs. If you don't have the resurrection, you're not a Christian. It's something that cannot be cut out. That's sometimes what's referred to as the sine qua non. Like, without this, you have nothing. So you could be a Christian and deny that the axe head was made to float. You could be a Christian and deny that the universe had a beginning. That would be really strange. But the gospel is not believe in the creation story. The gospel is that Christ died and rose again. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. And this is important for a number of reasons. Obviously, people usually don't like to talk about hell, and it's just not a nice thing to talk about. We probably can't fathom how terrible hell is, and thank God we're not going there. But sometimes I do sit around and just think, what would the worst existence be? And I think, the descriptions in the Bible, like burning forever, that would be pretty terrible. I'm quasi-claustrophobic, so I think of being trapped in a coffin and then buried in a 1,000-foot pit of burning magma. So you get the burning, but then you get the claustrophobia. And I would also have the flu. That would be another part of it. So, I'm not saying that hell is going to be like that. It's probably actually going to be even worse. But, hell can be a stumbling block for people. How can a good God send people to such a terrible place? But there's actually a lot of apologetic work being done on that. And have you guys ever heard of the idea that the people in hell, they don't really like being there, but they don't want to go to heaven either. A lot of times we think of people down there and they just want to come up to heaven and be with God. I think it was C.S. Lewis said that he believed that hell was locked from the inside. They don't really like being there, but they don't want to come and be in God's presence. You kind of see this with the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man never asks Abraham to get him out. He just says, send somebody to warn my brothers. Now, luckily, humanity, we're separated from God. The Bible says that we're actually God's enemies. But God is perfect love. Everybody likes to emphasize that aspect of God. But God is also perfect holiness, perfect justice. I think it's interesting when people see God, or if there's beings that are in the presence of God, they don't say love, love, love over and over again. They say holy, holy, holy over and over again. So God cannot be in the presence of unrighteousness forever. Now, I think one of the scariest things about hell is the eternality of it. If I were making up my own religious beliefs, I would make hell temporal, in the sense that you go there, you pay the price, and then you just kind of pass out of existence. That would be an annihilationist view. But I don't base my views on what I would like to happen. I base my views on what the Bible teaches. And I know that there are Christians that think that hell does not go on forever, but I don't think that that's what the text actually says. So, again, the gospel is
Can I ask a question?
yes.
What are do you have some of the resources of apologetics talking about hell?
Yeah, I think I'll put that in the resource folder. And by the way, I'm trying to put the resources at the bottom of the video too, so you don't need to go into the folder. They'll all be there. But there's a teaching called Is Hell Divine Overkill that I'll kind of put in there. So again, the gospel, the word technically means good news. And you got to tell the bad news before you tell the good news. But we were all separated from God. The Bible says we were his enemies. Christ came, lived a sinless life. He had to be sinless in order for the sacrifice to count. He died on the cross, and then he rose again, proving that the sacrifice was accepted. And if we put our faith and trust in that, we can be made right with God. And then, works are part of the Christian life. You don't do works to gain your salvation. You don't do works to keep your salvation. But the Bible does say that God has created works for us to do, and works can actually be a blessing. So part of the normal Christian life is doing good works. just having them in their appropriate place. So the resurrection is key. I'm going to use a number of sources for this. Probably the best source that I've found is this book here, which is The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. Now, if you look at this book, it can look a little daunting. It's 350 pages. But if you cut out the notes and the appendix, it's only 220 pages. So pretty easy read. This is probably the most straightforward and concise resource on this topic. And Gary Habermas is kind of the granddaddy of this argument anyway. I do have this other book. Last time I taught this class, I bought myself a gift at the end for surviving. And it was this. This is a little bit more daunting. It's about 700 pages. I think it's, if you don't count the notes, it's 620, which still, I mean, that's quite the read. I haven't really gotten to get into this too much, but from what I know, this is a pretty good resource. Very detailed. There's also a class by Gary Habermas, and I think I've mentioned this before, like there's a coffee house in Oklahoma that was started by two seminary graduates, and they have these teachers come in and give these teachings in sessions, and I think the one on the resurrection is 30 sessions long. Last time when I was preparing for this class, I listened to it twice, but I listened to it on double speed, so I got through it in the same amount of time. But I went online, and those videos are there for free. They usually charge for those, but if you go to credocourses.com, I believe it is, you can download the videos for no cost, which is a pretty good deal, in my opinion. And I'll link to that too. So as I said, this is Gary Habermas. He's kind of the granddaddy of this argument. When he was doing his doctoral dissertation in the 70s, he had struggled with doubt, and he wanted to do something with the resurrection. But he was going to a secular school, and so he was kind of afraid that his professors wouldn't really be into that. But he kind of proposed doing his dissertation, and they came back and said, okay, you can do the resurrection as your topic, but you can't just say it happened because the Bible said so. You have to back it up with evidence. And so he wrote that dissertation, and really he just kept going after he graduated, and he kept reading, and he is basically looking for a couple of things. He wants to find data that are very strongly evidenced pertaining to the historical Jesus, and he wants data that are granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, even the skeptical ones. So this isn't an appeal to the majority. He's not saying because most people believe it, therefore it's true. He's just saying, what are the things that if I were to sit down with somebody who works in historical Jesus studies, what would they already believe that I could kind of use in the conversation? And that might sound strange. Like, there are people out there who do not believe in Jesus, but who study him for a living. And there are people out there who study Jesus who actually go out of their way to try to undermine everything that Jesus stood for. But he wants to use the skeptic's own data, and he even favors the skeptical writings. So if he has like 2 hours to burn on a Saturday night, and he has in one hand a book about Jesus by a Christian and a book by a skeptic, he will favor the skeptic because that's what he is actually looking for. So after all these decades, he has found about a dozen things that pretty much everybody agrees on. And in the book, let's see, it's doing that thing again. In the book, he gives 5 facts because he said, why use 12 when 5 will do? But he says the first 4 meet both criteria, but the 5th one is only acknowledged by 70% of scholars, not by his standard of 95 to 97%. That's usually what he's going for. So he actually calls this a 4+1. Now, before we get into this, it would be nice to know a little background of history, how we do history. So when you read a history book, you are reading history, but the people who put that book together were engaged in something called historiography. And it's basically trying to figure out what makes one fact more certain than another. And there's a number of principles that could be used here, but I give 5 because these are in the book. But the first one is multiple independent sources. Why would a fact of ancient history be more reliable if there were multiple independent sources? What do you think?
If there's multiple
sources talking about the same thing, it's
Okay.
more likely to have happened.
Yeah, because it's better to have a plurality than just to hear it from one source. Okay? Another one is you want early testimony. Why would that be?
Closer to the event, the less likely it is to change.
Okay? So the story's not going to morph if you can get it early. That's good. Eyewitness testimony is also very good. That one's probably pretty self-explanatory. Like if you were there, you're better able to know what happened. What about testimony where the person giving the testimony has to make embarrassing admissions? Why would that be more likely to be true?
If it was made up, they wouldn't make it embarrassing.
Right. If you're just making up a story, you don't go out of your way to make yourself look bad or to make your job harder. And then finally, enemy attestation. Why is it better to have something said about a certain event or a certain person? Why is it better to have some attestation from an enemy?
Because it doesn't make them look good. You know, they're not gaining anything by it.
Right.
And they actually go against them.
Yeah, like an enemy's not going to go either way to make somebody look good that they don't like. So if you think about it, well, let's say Tyler was on trial and his best friend went in and said, Tyler's a great guy. I've never heard him tell a lie. That might be true, but if it's your best friend, it's not going to hold as much weight as if your enemy went in there and said, I hate Tyler's guts, but I must say, he's very honest. Like, the enemy's not just going to make that up. They might admit that, maybe somewhat begrudgingly, but if they admit it, that's a good indication that it's actually true. So, if you are not a Christian and you look at the history of Christianity, you have to explain how this religion got started. So, if you're not going to say that Jesus actually got up out of the grave, you have to have an alternative theory for what actually went down. So, I'm going to go through 5 natural objections, and then we're going to go through the arguments against those, and then we'll kind of revisit these, and I'll give you some other ones at the end. But the first objection is maybe the resurrection was just a legend. Maybe it was embellished over time, and the story actually started out without the resurrection, but then the details changed as Christianity grew, started to gain steam, and they said, hey, you know this Jesus guy? He was born of a virgin. And Jesus was crucified, and he got up out of the grave. And then, as time went on, these embellishments made it into the Bible. There's also a variation of this, which is called the pagan myth, which is the idea that the biblical writers are actually just copying from earlier pagan myths, and the Bible is just kind of a jumble of all these different stories. There's also an idea that's been put out there. Maybe the disciples just lied. Maybe they invented the story because they were embarrassed that this guy that they'd been following around for 3 years was brutally killed, crucified on the cross. They wanted people to believe so badly that they got together, they stole the body, the tomb was empty, and they said, look, he rose from the dead. This one's kind of interesting. Some people have said maybe the disciples just went to the wrong tomb. Like they really believed that Jesus rose, but they were grieving. Maybe when they went, it was very dark out and they couldn't tell where they were. But they didn't know exactly where the tomb was, according to this view. And later they went, the tomb was empty, and they had just thought that Jesus had resurrected. Because they actually believed it, they went out, they were willing to preach, they were willing to suffer, they were willing to die. But it was all because they went to the wrong place. This one's been popular in the past. This is called the swoon theory. Maybe Jesus didn't die on the cross, he just appeared to die. And there's different variations of this. Some people say maybe he really did go into a coma, or he just fainted. Other people say maybe he really just faked his death. And he thought, if I just hang here long enough, and I'm still, and I'm not screaming, then maybe they'll take me down and I'll survive. Some people say if he did go into a coma, you take him into the grave, the air is cooler in there. Maybe he was just revived, and he was just like, where am I? And he got up, pushed the stone away, walked to the disciples' house, maybe cleaned himself up on the way there, and the disciples saw him and said, wow, he did rise from the dead. And finally, maybe they just had a mass hallucination. The disciples really believed that they saw him because they were all hallucinating. After all, the mind can play tricks on you, especially when you're grieving. And so this whole Christianity is just based on the fact that people saw something. Now, here are the 5 facts that Habermas and Licona give in this book. So the first fact is that Jesus died by crucifixion. The second fact is that the disciples sincerely believed that he rose and appeared. The third fact is that Paul persecuted the church but later converted. The fourth fact is James started out as a skeptic but later converted. And the fifth fact is that the tomb was empty. So these are the things that Habermas has looked through the literature, and he said these are the facts that most people agree happened. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these in detail, but I will go through the first one, and we'll kind of look over this thing with a fine-tooth comb. I just don't want to get to the end of the first fact and you think we'll be here for like 7 hours. We'll kind of fly through the other 4. But we know that Jesus died by crucifixion. It's one thing to say that it happened. It's another thing to say, how do we know that it happened? And it's good to have a background knowledge on what crucifixion actually is. Crucifixion means death. Now, a skeptic already might protest and say, well, we have historical record of someone surviving the crucifixion. And basically what happened was the Romans were crucifying so many people in Jerusalem that they actually ran out of wood. And the historian Josephus was walking around and he saw 3 people that he knew who had been crucified. And they asked him to get them off the cross. He went to the Roman authorities. They were immediately taken down from the cross. 2 of them still died, but 1 survived. Now, for one thing, he went up on the cross and then immediately came down. So the reason crucifixion is so terrible is the crucifixion actually starts with whipping, and especially in Jesus' case, he was whipped first. Sometimes the Romans called this pre-death because the soldiers were very experienced in this. We have historical record of people being whipped so badly that you could see their intestines like poking out through their back. There would be loss of blood, but you actually don't die from blood loss in a crucifixion. Like the Persians came up with crucifixion, but the Romans perfected it. And they wanted it to be long and gruesome and terrible. So basically, they would stretch your arms out. Sometimes they would tie people to the cross, but sometimes they would nail people. Some used to argue that the Bible was legendary because we didn't have any other account of people being nailed, but we have found bodies with nails in them, nail holes, etc. Now, you can't put a nail right through the palm because you would fall right off the cross. So that's something that just has kind of grown out of painting. But back then, like your wrist would have been considered part of your hand, and they would have put that nail right between your radius and your ulna, probably crushing the nerve that's in there. And that would have been pretty disgusting. What's that nerve called? Do you remember? Weren't you like a nursing major or something?
Yes. I don't remember.
The median nerve. I think it's called the median nerve. I think I've heard somebody say, like, imagine someone like smashing your funny bone with a sledgehammer. So you're hanging there, and with your arms stretched out like that, you can either breathe in but not breathe out, or vice versa. I can't remember which one's which. But in order to keep your respiration, you actually have to push up off of your feet, and then you slump back down. Then you push up off your feet, your back is grinding against the cross. And it was meant to be really disgusting, and people were meant to see it. So you could look up on the cross and say, that's what happens to a person who messes with the Roman Empire. Now, John has a pretty interesting detail in his gospel. It says that a soldier pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and John says that blood and water came out. And there are doctors who have actually read the Bible, looked at crucifixion, what it's like, and have actually done a kind of autopsy on Jesus to figure out what happened. And they say, like, if you are in a stressful situation like that, the sac around your heart can fill up with fluid. And so the idea is when that spear went in there, it probably pierced the heart, and that's why John saw water and blood come out. And then just as a little cultural reference here, crucifixion in the Bible is called a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Greeks. I think in the Greco-Roman world, the word crucify and cross were like cuss words. Like you didn't say them in polite society. And people kind of went out of their way to avoid saying those words because it was that gross. We actually have a word still today, excruciating, means out of the cross. So some of this lingo is still in our vocabulary even apart from the Bible. Now, as far as historical sources that Jesus died by crucifixion, we have the biblical account. The Gospels actually do count as history. Like a lot of people would protest to that and say, well, you can't use the Bible. But even non-believing historians, they use the Bible. They think that it's a decently reliable book. They just don't treat it the same way we do. They don't think it's inerrant. They don't accept the miracle accounts. Now, kind of like a weird thing with this, it isn't all four Gospels, but when you look at the Bible through the lens of like historiography, if it's in John, it's a source. If it's in Luke only, no. If it's in John, it's a source. If it's in Luke, it's a source. If it's in Mark, it's a source. But if it's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four, it actually only counts as two sources because people think that Luke and Mark used Matthew. But the crucifixion does occur in every gospel. We also know from the Jewish historian, Josephus, when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified. And that was written in the late 90s in the work Antiquities of the Jews. So Josephus mentions Pilate, and he talks about the crucifixion. Then we have a Roman historian, Tacitus. In Annals, around AD 115, he says, Nero fastened the guilt of the burning of Rome and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here Tacitus is mentioning Pilate again. He mentions Christ, although he thinks his name is Chrestus, but whatever. He mentions Christians and that he suffered the extreme penalty. And that's probably euphemistic language for the crucifixion. Like he doesn't want to come right out and say it. He goes on to say, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So we can see Tacitus is not a friend of Christianity. He calls it a mischievous superstition. He calls it the evil, and he references it as something hideous and shameful. There was a Greek satirist called Lucian of Samosata. In his work, Death of Peregrine, he mentions the crucifixion. There was a Stoic philosopher named Marabar Serapion who wrote a letter to his son, and in that letter he said that the wise king was killed. The wise king of the Jews was killed. We also know from the Jewish Talmud, in Sanhedrin 43, it says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged. So you can see, here's some of these sources. We have friendly sources, we have antagonistic sources. So if you go back to the historiography and these 5 principles, you see we have multiple independent sources. Just in the first 100 years after the crucifixion, we have at least 11 sources that Jesus died by crucifixion. We have more sources on this than Caesar, more sources than the life of Alexander the Great. Now, do you remember weeks ago when I said, like, Harold Hoehner, he was talking about prophecy. He was talking about the death of Christ. And he said history pivots on that point, but some of that history is really spotty. He wasn't saying that the sources for the crucifixion are spotty. He was just saying the year is hard to pin down. This is probably the best attested event in ancient history. One of the nice things about this is every Easter and every Christmas, you will see documentaries on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, in magazines, and as we can see here in the Washington Post, doubting whether Jesus even existed. And so here the headline reads, "Did the historical Jesus really exist? The evidence just doesn't add up." That is the stupidest thing that I've ever heard. From a historian standpoint, something in the ancient world, if you have two sources that can corroborate each other, they say that it happened, because coming across two sources is so unlikely that if you can find just two, you're sitting pretty well. We have over 11, and if you go 50 years even further out, I think the number goes up to over 22. 22 sources within the first 150 years that Jesus died on the cross.
I might have asked you last time, but what does that article say?
I read it last time, and it's just all this evidence that maybe it was just made up. But I could link to that if you want it.
It'd be interesting to to talk through it.
Well, if you remember from weeks ago, we talked about Bart Ehrman, and he is not very friendly to Christianity. And there's a video online of him, I think he's basically scolding a crowd. He's doing a Q&A or something, and somebody had come up and asked about why don't we just say that Jesus never existed? And he told them yeah, if Jesus never existed, that would be great, but all the evidence says to the contrary, and when you say that Jesus never existed, you just look foolish. Now, he would be an enemy of Christianity, but at least he knows the background.
Bart said that?
Yeah. So what about early testimony? The New Testament was finished before AD 100. Josephus wrote before AD 100. Tacitus, Marabar Serapion. Actually, Tacitus was 115. I don't know why that says before 100. Just to give you something to compare this to, Alexander the Great, I think we have 5 sources for Alexander's life. The 2 best sources are his biographers, Arrian and Plutarch, and they don't come on the scene for 400 years after Alexander dies. And nobody really questions Alexander. So we have things that are just a news flash as far as the ancient world was concerned. We also have eyewitness testimonies. The Gospels in general are reliable. And like I said, I think that blood and water counts as an eyewitness testimony because John was not a doctor. Medicine in the first century was super primitive, so it's not like people could flip through the encyclopedia and say, okay, how are we going to fake this for everybody? They saw the blood and water come out. It happened. What about embarrassing admissions? The crucifixion itself is embarrassing. But not only that, before the crucifixion, the disciples said they were willing to die with Jesus. Then when he's arrested, they all scatter. The only people that went to the cross with Christ from his entourage were the women and probably John. And so it would be kind of embarrassing to say that all these strong men were hiding in their houses with the doors locked while the women actually went out and saw Jesus get crucified. You wouldn't make that detail up. Also, from a Jewish standpoint, we know from Deuteronomy 21, 22 and 23 says, "And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God." So the idea of the Messiah, God in the flesh, being put up on a tree and dying, that was like an oxymoron to the Jewish mind. They did not see that coming. Paul says in Galatians 3:23, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" 1 Corinthians 1:23 says, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles." That word stumbling block in the Greek is skandalon. It was very scandalous. If you were trying to make up a religion, you wouldn't invent the crucifixion because it's going to make your job more difficult, especially in the first century in the Roman Empire. Here is some Roman graffiti. It's very difficult to see, so here's an artist's drawing. This says, "Alexmenos worships his god." And many people believe that this is the first pictorial reference to Christ. And yes, he has the head of a donkey. But you can see in that culture, to hear that someone was worshiping a god that had died on the cross would have just been ludicrous. Do we have enemy attestation? The Talmud argues against Christ. The Talmud is interesting because it actually admits that Christ did miracles, but it says he was a magician. So even them trying to undermine Christ, they actually admit some pretty interesting things. And I think that whole thing, that whole quote from the Talmud where it says Yeshua was hanged, I think the idea behind that is hey, Jews, you know what happens to a person who's hanged, right? And so they're trying to argue against Christ, but because that's in the Talmud, we have one more piece of evidence that Jesus actually was crucified. So Tacitus did not view Christians favorably. Josephus, Lucian, and probably Marabar Serapion, they're not as antagonistic as Tacitus was, but they were probably not believers. So they count as enemy testimony because they're not going to go out of their way to make the Christians look good. There's a group of radical scholars known as the Jesus Seminar. And they're so radical that even other skeptics say that watching these guys interact is like watching a circus because they're just so far to that skeptical side. And even some of the big names in the Jesus Seminar, like Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, they say that the fact that Jesus died on the cross is probably the best attested fact of the ancient world. It happened. But what about fact 2? The disciples sincerely believed he arose and appeared. How do we know this? There's actually 2 lines of evidence. They claimed that Jesus rose and appeared. They were also willing to suffer and die for that claim. How do we know that they claimed he rose and appeared? We know that from the Gospel in Acts and the Apostolic Fathers. Now, some people would say, well, that's kind of circular. You're using the Bible to prove this. But if you want to know what someone believes, it's good to ask them, or in this case, look at a record that states what they believed. And obviously the Gospels and Acts would be a good account of what the disciples were actually teaching. Paul in Galatians says that I received the gospel by revelation of Jesus Christ. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that he appeared. So Paul counts as another source. 1 Corinthians 15 is a really great passage. It's a very concise presentation of the gospel. And it says, "For I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as though one born at the wrong time, he appeared to me also." Now, another cool thing about 1 Corinthians 15, these first couple verses, it has a very poetic structure. And so not only is he saying, this is what I received, and here it is, but the structure of the epistle changes there. And a lot of times when you see, there's something kind of like this in Philippians too. When you see a structure like that, it's probably either a hymn or oral testimony or something that was put together in order to be remembered. And so a lot of scholars think that those lines in there, he died for our sins according to the Scriptures, he was buried, he was raised according to the Scriptures, that formula goes back to within years, maybe even months of the crucifixion. So even though 1 Corinthians is not the oldest book in the New Testament, those lines are the most primitive piece of Christian literature that we have. And so the idea that Jesus rose and appeared goes all the way back to the beginning, is basically what that means. But it's one thing to say that he appeared and that he rose. It's also another to be willing to die and to suffer for those things. So how do we know they were willing to suffer and die? We know that from the New Testament. Most of the disciples died rather than deny the resurrection. Now, there's not a whole lot of disciples dying in the New Testament. There's actually only 2. But we know that the other disciples died from the works outside of the Bible. So the church fathers, the historians. There are conflicting accounts on how the disciples died and where, but actually the most trustworthy accounts are for the most prominent disciples. And, just because you have differing accounts, you can still weigh those and try to figure out which one is authentic. At some point, sometimes people are like, I want to put my town on the map, so I'm going to say that a disciple died here. You can investigate that.
Are there accounts that argue against their martyrdom?
That's exactly what I was going to say. We don't have any accounts of any of them living into old age and retiring by the sea or something like that. We do think that John, if one of them was not killed for their faith, it was John. But there are accounts that John was tortured, and I think some people do believe that John was actually martyred too. But we know that he was exiled to the island of Patmos. It's not like he lived a cushy life preaching Christ. And not only that, but these guys went out in opposite directions. And so a lot of people think that Thomas went to India. Let's just assume that that's true for now. But if he's all the way over in India and the other disciples are in northern Africa, in the Middle East, in parts of what would become Europe, if he's about ready to be killed, why not, if he knows that it's a lie, why not just give it away and say, okay, well, if you're going to kill me for this, then I'll renounce my faith. We don't have any account that anything like that happened. So we know the disciples' deaths, not from the Bible, but from Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Tertullian, Origen. And then there was a guy named Eusebius who wrote an ecclesiastical history. And so he cites a bunch of people. And in that work, he cites Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, Origen, Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. So what about the third fact? Paul persecuted the church, but later converted. How do we know? Paul claims that Jesus appeared to him. We know this from his own writings. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, also counts as another source. We also know from the Christians who were living in Judea at the time that that's what Paul was claiming. If you remember, the Christians were kind of afraid when they heard that Paul had changed because they were like, is this for real? But those Christians would have seen his efforts and his changed heart. We know that Paul is willing to suffer and die again from his own writings and from the book of Acts. Outside the Bible, some church fathers attest to this as well. Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, and then these last 2, these are in Eusebius, that's why there's an E after them. We don't have their works, but they're preserved in the works of Eusebius, Dionysius of Corinth, and Origen. James, the brother of Jesus, started out as a skeptic, but later converted. We see his conversion because in Mark 3:21, it says that when Jesus' family heard about what he was doing, they went out to restrain him, for they said he is out of his mind. In John 7:5, it says not even his own brothers believed in him. So that's before the crucifixion. Then after the crucifixion, 1 Corinthians 15 mentions James, and we know from history that James became a leader of the early church. See Acts 15 and Galatians 1. His martyrdom is recounted by Josephus, and Eusebius cites Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria. The final fact is the one that Gary Habermas does not use. If you ever see a video of an apologist using this argument, sometimes they'll use less facts than I do. Sometimes they'll put them in different order. I just put them in this order and use these ones because that's what's in the book. But I know William Lane Craig uses this fact because even though it's not up to Gary Habermas's standards, you still have 70% of scholars agreeing that the tomb was empty. Habermas points out there are 23 arguments for the empty tomb and 14 arguments against. Now, it's not that you just look and see which one has the most arguments and go for that. You have to weigh the arguments. But a good argument for the fact that the tomb was empty is what Habermas and Licona call the Jerusalem factor. Jesus died in Jerusalem. Jesus is said to appear in Jerusalem. If the tomb wasn't empty, why didn't the Jews or the Romans bring out the body and show everybody? Both of those groups would have had incentive to do so. If they can't produce the body, then the tomb probably was empty. From a historical standpoint, again, we know the tomb was empty from the Bible. We also have enemy attestation. The early critics of Christianity accused the disciples of stealing the body. Now, if your enemies are accusing you of stealing the body, then that means the tomb is empty. We know that from Matthew 28, 12 through 13. Some of the church fathers, when they're dialoguing with non-believers, the non-believers are accusing the disciples of stealing the body. So Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho, and in Tertullian's writing, he mentions that too. Also, the fact that the women were the first to find the tomb, that is a huge deal. They found the tomb empty. If you were making up this story, you wouldn't put the women in there. The Jews did not look kindly on the testimony of women. We know from Josephus, it says, "But let not the testimony of a woman be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." Now, that's not me talking, that's Josephus. And that's not the Bible talking either. I think a lot of times we see like Christians do or say things, Jews do or say things. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's part of the religion. To tell you the truth, I've been reading the Bible since I was 16, and if I truly thought that the Bible taught that women were inferior, then that would be my point of view. If I really thought that the Bible taught that men were inferior, that would also be my point of view. I'm that radical. But the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says that men and women are created equal. We're in the image of God. Even back in Genesis, when it says male and female, he created them, that's a big deal. We kind of gloss over those passages. I was reading a book once by a feminist, and she made a big deal about the fact that in the early chapters of Genesis, Adam is alone, and then God comes in and says, "I'll give you a helper." She's like, see, Eve was just an afterthought, and then she's just a helper, like an animal. But that word helper is actually a word that the Bible uses for God himself later in the Bible. So it's not that Eve was insignificant, that's for sure. The Romans also did not look kindly on the testimony of women. Nope, sorry. These are still Jews. I'm getting ahead of myself. The Talmud says, this is the rule. All testimony that a woman is not fit to give, these above are also not fit to give. So this passage in Rosh Hashanah 1:8 has given a list of people whose testimony is not fit. So that's why it says these above are not fit to give. And the Romans didn't look too kindly on the testimony of women either. It's a common belief that women were not allowed to testify in court, but I think they were allowed to testify. It was just their testimony had more or less weight depending on how serious the crime was. And so I think it was like the more serious the crime, the less weight a woman's testimony had. Either that or I have that backwards. But they were allowed to testify. It just wasn't as robust testimony as you would get from a man. From their point of view, of course. So again, here are the 5 minimal facts. Now, with a lot of these teachings that we've done, we go into an excruciating amount of detail. You might be thinking, how in the world am I going to memorize all this? Actually, there's only 5 facts to memorize. Then you could go into the background. And the nice thing about this is, fact 1 deals with the death of Jesus. Fact 5 deals with the burial of Jesus. So you got the death, the burial, and then in between, those are all just appearances to different people. Fact 2, he appears to his friends. Fact 3, he appears to an enemy. Fact 4, he appears to his brother. So that's kind of how I put those together to memorize those. Although actually, the way that I memorized these was to teach this class. Like after I taught this the first time, those facts have never left my brain. So if anybody wants to teach next time, just put your name in the hat. So let's go back to these objections. And this is where you need that little piece of paper I gave you. The 5 facts are not in question. We're going to look over these objections, and then you look at that little card and see which one of these facts could you use to destroy these objections. Sometimes it's only one fact, sometimes it's multiple. So I'll do the first one so you can kind of see how this goes. The first objection was the legend objection. Maybe the resurrection was just a story that was embellished over time. It started without the resurrection, but the details changed as Christianity grew, and these embellishments later made it into the Bible. The reason this doesn't work in relation to the minimal facts is you still get the crucifixion, but the disciples believed he appeared from the very beginning. There was not enough time for a legend to grow in that culture. There was not enough time for a legend to grow up. This doesn't explain how Paul, who was out there persecuting the believers, this doesn't explain how he became a believer, because he said that Christ appeared to him. Same thing with James, and this doesn't answer the empty tomb. If it's a legend, why was the tomb empty? So do you see how that kind of works? What minimal facts could you use for this one? Maybe the disciples lied, they invented the story because they were embarrassed that the teacher they had followed for 3 years was dead. They wanted people to believe, so they stole the body. What facts demolish this argument? Does this explain the empty tomb?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it does, because it says the disciples stole the body. Would this explain the fact that the disciples believed that they had seen the risen Christ? No, it does not. Pretty much you still have the crucifixion, but you don't have the disciples believing he appeared. This doesn't explain why Paul, who persecuted the believers, became a believer. It doesn't explain how the skeptic James was converted and willing to be martyred. They didn't lie because they were willing to die for the message.
Back to the empty tomb, and the claim that his body was stolen. Wasn't it guarded by trained Roman soldiers? So how could that be?
Yeah, the skeptics don't believe that there was a guard, basically, yeah. I don't know exactly why that is. I know Christians disagree on whether the guard was a Jewish guard or a Roman guard. There's actually some reason to believe, there's reasons that it could be either one. I tend toward a Roman guard. I'm hoping that that's not me being influenced by movies that I've seen, but I think there's more evidence that it was Roman. But that's a good point. What about this one? They went to the wrong tomb. What facts could you use to demolish this argument?
It was never corrected. They never said, this is the right tomb, or here's the body, or anything like that. You would think that, given the opportunity, they'd correct it at some point down the road.
Okay. Now, you bring up a good point. Like, the disciples knew who owned the tomb. So if they had went to the wrong tomb, Joseph of Arimathea could have corrected them, right? But still, that doesn't pertain to the facts, the minimal facts. But on that point, there are ways to confront these arguments, even apart from the minimal facts. But of those 5, which ones can't be explained by this?
2, 3, 4.
2, 3, and 4. Very good. It's the same as the last one. You can explain the crucifixion, you can explain the empty tomb, but you can't explain why all these people actually believed he appeared. Because remember, the disciples weren't proclaiming just an empty tomb. They were proclaiming that Jesus actually appeared to us. Paul said he appeared to me. It's not just that the tomb is empty. That's not where the disciples got the idea.
It wasn't even like just one day. It was like a month or something that he was
It was like 40 days.
before he ascended.
Yeah. And there's that passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul says like 500 people saw him. And kind of implied in that is like some of these people are dead, but if you want to know, like a lot of them are still alive. Like you can go talk to them. So what about the swoon theory? There's actually only one fact that you could... Very good. The swoon theory explains fact 2, 3, 4, and 5, but it does not explain fact 1. Jesus did not fake his death on the cross. Jesus actually died. And not only that, kind of like back to your point, like you can use other facts to confront these. There was actually a non-believer, a very skeptical, like anti-Christian man who said this theory is totally bankrupt. Because if you think about it, like let's say Jesus gets up out of the tomb. Like first of all, how does he get out? How does he even make it to the disciples' house? And if he knocks on the door and claims to have been resurrected, the disciples would have seen a frail, like on death's door, mangle of a man. And do you really think that Thomas is standing over there in the corner thinking, wow, resurrected body, can't wait to get mine? Probably not. Finally, hallucination. I'll just go over this one since we're over time here. The disciples really believed it was one big group hallucination. After all, grief can play tricks on the mind. You still have the crucifixion. You still have the fact that the disciples believed he appeared to them, but it doesn't explain why Paul became a believer, because Paul wasn't grieving. Paul had no incentive to join in to the hallucination. Same with James. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. If you see a hallucination of Jesus, his body's still in the grave, but the tomb was empty. Gary Habermas once did a debate with an atheist, very famous atheist named Anthony Flew. And Anthony Flew actually ended up becoming some sort of a deist. He wrote a book called There Is a God, and he was more convinced by the fine-tuning and the design of the universe. But at that time, Anthony Flew was an atheist, and Anthony Flew actually used this objection to the resurrection. He said maybe it was just a mass hallucination. And Gary Habermas pointed out, mass hallucinations don't exist. That's like going up to your friend and saying, hey, do you remember that dream that we had last night where we were like fixing my car and that wrench fell on your foot? Man, that was funny. Your friend would be like, what are you talking about? Like, dreams are subjective. You can't share a dream. Mike Licona says it's like he wishes he could just wake up in the middle of the night and like wake up his wife and say, honey, I'm having a dream we're in Hawaii. You go to sleep, have the dream with me, and then we'll save on vacation. But hallucinations just don't happen. And Anthony Flew came back and said, well, you say that mass hallucinations don't happen, but I say men don't get up out of the grave either. And he thought it was this kind of gotcha moment. And I don't know if this comes out in the debate or just like with further study, but Gary Habermas points out later, like, even if it was a mass hallucination, that's still pretty miraculous. Like, what are the chances that you have multiple mass hallucinations from multiple people, and all of the mass hallucinations that have ever taken place in the universe all center around like one guy? That would be something that you would want to look into. Now, obviously, we don't believe it's a hallucination, but still, it doesn't get the unbeliever out of all the problems. There are some other ones that you can't use the minimal facts approach on. For example, the Quran mentions the crucifixion in Surah 4, 157 and 158, where we read, and for their saying, indeed we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. And they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them. And indeed those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of assumption, and they did not kill him for certain. Rather, Allah raised him to himself, and ever is Allah exalted in might and wise. Now, even though you can't go at this with the minimal facts, how could you go about responding to the Muslims? Your average Muslim on the street will say that Allah provided a substitute and disguised him. But there is a guy named David Wood who does a lot of work with Muslims, and he says the problem with this is if Allah provides a substitute and puts the substitute on the cross, then Allah is tricking people into believing in Jesus. And so basically, Allah would be responsible for founding Christianity. And if you remember back to weeks ago, we talked about the sin of shirk in Islam, which is ascribing partners to Allah. So that would be like believing that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the sin of shirk. And if Allah actually did this, then that would make Allah the reason why a vast majority of people have committed the sin of shirk. Because Jesus' followers really believed he'd been crucified, so Allah is the author of Christianity, a competing religion. There is an idea that Jesus was just a space alien and his crucifixion was just a cosmic joke. So you have the resurrection, but you deny God as the cause. I've heard it said that it may be better to deal with academic criticisms first, and then if there's time left, you can look at the fun ones. Obviously, you would go about this probably more with a cosmological, teleological argument. There's a really awesome book by Hugh Ross, who we've talked about before. He's the astrophysicist who has pastored a church for like 30 years. And he wrote this really cool book it was an astrophysicist, Hugh Ross. It was a philosopher, and then this guy who used to work for the government. And they talk about like alien encounters and space travel and what it would take to go from like one star to the next. And you'd basically need a spaceship the size of a planet. And if it hit a grain of sand, it would explode because you'd have to be going like 99% the speed of light. I really enjoyed the book. But, that thought is out there. And finally, William Lane Craig did a debate with a man whose argument was Jesus had a long-lost brother. It was his twin who just so happened to come back right after the crucifixion, and he walked around telling everybody he was Jesus, and that's how Christianity got started. And William Lane Craig is usually the epitome of that 1 Peter 3:15, where you reply with gentleness. But it was pretty fun to see William Lane Craig kind of licking his chops like, this debate's going to be pretty easy. It was almost funny. It was almost comical. So I like setting it up like this. For some reason, like this pictorial arrangement is really easy for me to memorize. And, if you want access to this, I can send that your way. So